Majestic ancient pyramids, majestic ancient sphinxes. But then come new times, new people, and the old gods have to leave to give their place to the new ones. In the year 30 BC, the Roman Emperor Augustus entered Alexandria. The great city fell. So did the great Egyptian kingdom. And the homeland of majestic pharaohs became a Roman province. Now Egypt was ruled by appointed governors. The emperor resided in Rome, and at times Egyptian people did not even know who their ruler was. However, Egypt was a rich province which provided a lot of grain, paid taxes, and that is why Roman rulers did not interfere in local traditions and culture. The Egyptian culture dies along with its temples. When Egyptian temples as structures cease to exist, it happens due to some changes in social and economic aspects of life. And as a matter of fact, temples become extinct, and people don't know hieroglyphic culture anymore. So when the language disappears, then the culture itself dies. But this will only happen 4 centuries later, when the great Roman Empire will fall. Egypt will become a part of the Byzantine Empire, and the old gods, along with their funerary rituals, will be forbidden. At the moment, Egypt is still great, and seems to be eternal. Eternal like pyramids, eternal like the sphinxes looking at us. These are the symbols of Egypt and its afterworld. And Egyptian culture in its integrity was justified by the afterworld, and regarded it as the essence of its own existence. A mummy, a sarcophagus, a pyramid. Although pyramids are not built anymore, it is too expensive, and there are no possible commissioners to request them. All the rest is still present, and mummification is still considered the essential part of the funerary ritual. But it was a common belief for quite a long time that under the Roman reign, the embalming process differed from the traditional one. Nevertheless, it is not true. There exists an extra class embalming or mummification. When the body gets cleared of all internal organs, it is a ritual that lasts for 70 days, and the body is covered in all sorts of aromatic substances. It is dried and then wrapped. There are also 2 other ways of mummifying. They are less expensive, right? The cheapest method does not involve getting rid of any internal organs at all. So practically, the body is dried, with great help from the Egyptian climate, and then it is wrapped, and you have, in fact, a mummy. The quality of embalming always depended on the social and financial status of the deceased. The Romans and the Greeks who settled in Egypt accepted the tradition of mummification, but the decorations for the mummies did indeed change with their arrival. First of all, Carton Edges appeared in ancient Egypt under the Roman reign. These heavy linen strips, soaked in gesso, were applied on a mold. After drying, it was cut along the back, and the mummy was put into the carton edge through this cut. Such carton edges could be afforded only by wealthy customers. A carton edge could be shortened and only cover the upper part of the body, as opposed to full-body carton edges. It could be gilded or colored vividly. Then the body was usually put in a sarcophagus, but it could also be buried in a carton edge. Moreover, gesso masks appear at this time. They were cast using a mold and then decorated with paint. Interestingly, original Egyptian motifs eventually became less and less common on Egyptian masks. And if before the masks were placed in a rather flat way, later the position of the head was changed. The masks were lifted. First, researchers associated this phenomenon with the ideas of resurrection. But most probably, it was done so to give a more prominent position to the mask, so that it could be seen in detail. And here, Romans living in Egypt brought an essential element. Traditional idealized images of the deceased were replaced by real portraits. But this tradition is not even Egyptian, and if we take a look at a gesso mask, it is very similar to Roman sculptural portraits, to the Verissimo tradition, right? Which means an exact depiction of personal traits. And the Romans indeed had so-called ancestors' masks. These were portrait images stored in cabinets, but unfortunately we only know the descriptions of such masks. The masks themselves are not preserved. They were made of wax. But there are Roman sculptural portraits that represent exact copies of ancestors' masks as well. Thus, these are images of people who lived before. First of all, these masks made one a part of domestic cults. Sacrifices were offered to them. They were commemorated and so on. Secondly, when a nobleman died, these masks were carried after him. This was exactly a symbol of nobility, a man whose ancestors are renowned, a renowned man, a noble man. We can even suggest not a kind of influence, but an integration of several traditions. It turns out that the Roman portraits tradition found fertile soil because Egypt already had its own portraits tradition, although a very peculiar one. Thus, funerary masks in some Egyptian regions were replaced with portraits that were first painted on cedar or cypress plates. They were placed on the second layer of linen strips. These plates are known in art history as Fayum portraits, after the Fayum oasis where they were first discovered in their greatest quantity. Fayum is situated in Middle Egypt, and its name derives from the word Payom, which means Great Lake. The Fayum oasis has always been a rich agricultural region, with rich soil thanks to Lake Morris. It was a place where wealthy people lived, and during the Ptolemaic reign, after 332 BC, it became a place for Greeks to settle. Soldiers of the Greek army were given land in Egypt as a reward for their service, including the land in the Fayum oasis. This became a center of Greek culture. Fayum portraits are housed in various museums around the world. Nonetheless, we do not know much about them. This resulted from sacks and barbaric digging of the 19th century. The portraits that did not seem to represent any value for the diggers were taken from the tombs and thrown away. Scientists are still unsure whether the portraits bear exact similarities with the mummies or if these images are approximate. But even this situation has happy exceptions. The portraits found during the archaeological missions of the celebrated British archaeologist Flinders Petrie. In the beginning of the 20th century, Petrie led his missions closely adhering to standard digging practices. The places where the mummies still containing their portraits were found were recorded. They were not detached from the mummies, and it's great because here we witness this unique combination of something that cannot be combined. Yes, basically, it is classical painting, these portraits which can be compared to today's photography. In fact, yes, because what is a portrait? In terms of classical art, it is a low genre, as opposed to mythological paintings, heroic scenes, right? At the most, portraits could be of philosophers or rulers, but a portrait of an ordinary person? Well, it is already a Roman phenomenon in a way. Roman or Greek and Roman, when the Greeks focus on a person. This portrait is inserted in a mummy. It is something impossible for the Greeks, because they burned bodies, and it is impossible for them to conserve a dead body, even in a tomb. And nevertheless, this Greek population adopts Egyptian traditions. So they try to bury, but not all of them. But most of them try to bury according to the Egyptian traditions. And by the way, here comes a question. Why?
Египтяне верили в жизнь после смерти, но это, конечно, неудивительно.
Well, the answer can be found in religion, in the fact that Egyptians believed in the afterlife. Well, it's no surprise all the ancient cultures had the concept of life not ending with death, but moving along to another realm. But if we take a look at what kind of afterlife was promised to people by, let's say, the Greeks, Greek as well as Roman mythology, it's a kind of earthly life in Hades, in a form of a shadow, a bleak and starved existence. The Egyptians, on the other hand, promised a life much more colorful. They promised a union with God. Looking at these strikingly real faces, one can start to believe that the resurrection is possible, as well as eternal life.
Что касается самих портретов вот этого явления,
As for the portraits themselves, this phenomenon, there exist some complications. For example, were they used in any other way? I mean, were they only inserted in the mummies, or were they painted during a person's lifetime, and then kept in living rooms, atriums, houses, and when the person died? Was the portrait's surface retouched? Was it cut in order to be inserted in a mummy? This question is still under discussion. An interesting experiment was carried out at the British Museum. They decided to estimate similarities between the portraits and the corresponding mummies. And so they conducted a facial reconstruction. The experiment was carried out on several mummies. The portraits were taken away and the mummies were sent to anthropologists. The anthropologists did not see the portraits. They scanned the skull, doing what they do during reconstructions, and they announced the results, and it was almost a 100% match. Two of the portraits which participated in such experiments are known, and they are pretty exact. But this was not always the case. There is, for instance, a very interesting portrait in Copenhagen. It underwent a similar study as well. The portrait shows a young, flourishing man, and the mummy belongs to an old one. So apparently he died in his old age. But the portrait was maybe executed during his life. I am not sure if he posed for it or if the artist made it by memory. But anyways, I guess this portrait belongs to him. At the same time, in the 1st century AD, shroud portraits appear. Such shrouds covered the whole body, and it most often pictured a man in full length. There is also an assumption suggesting that shrouds could serve to cover coffins, or were hung on tomb walls like paintings. For instance, a shroud with an image of a man from the collection of the Pushkin State Museum of Fine Arts is in such good condition that it is unlikely that a mummy was ever wrapped in it. Everything related to the funerary ritual was expensive, especially shrouds made of fine linen. According to papyri, prices for shrouds ranged from 100 up to 600 drachmas, and 600 drachmas was as much as an average artisan made in a year. If we add putting a mummy in a coffin and placing the coffin in a tomb, the prices were enormous. By the way, here is an interesting fact about labels on mummies. This tradition survives up until Coptic times, 7th or 8th century. There are some labels of a later period, as well as mummies. Bodies were embalmed even despite prohibition of pagan cults, and people kept on executing mummifications. So what are these labels? These are small wooden plates bearing the name of the deceased, sometimes his profession, usually his age and destination. It seems like these mummies were supposed to be shipped to another city, a sort of particular shipment. So, for example, a person died in another city and wanted to be buried in his homeland. So the mummy was shipped there. The labels were written in different languages, usually in Greek and Egyptian. Well, Egyptian was already a Demotic language. There are almost no labels in Latin. So this is a peculiar phenomenon of the time.
Не встречается, но вот такое явление тоже этого периода.
Even if the mummy was not shipped anywhere, the burial required a lot of funds. It was possible to place the body in a public tomb. This option was the cheapest. But considering the attitude of ancient Egyptians towards the afterlife, it is clear that they tried to create a house-like tomb, often as a temple. Such tombs were situated in necropolis. Tuna el-Gebel in Middle Egypt. Here archaeologists discovered the city of the dead. It is a city with streets, and we indeed see houses along these streets, houses of the dead, and small tombs in shapes of stone coffins. And by the way, close to this necropolis, there is a necropolis of sacred animals. And in the distance there is a separate tomb of Petosiris. It dates from the very beginning of the Hellenistic period. So in these tombs there were already wall decorations. But these were reliefs, painted reliefs in a pure Greek style. One would argue that the Greeks could not possibly influence the culture. But let us not forget that the Greeks had already been living in Egypt by that time. Contacts with Greeks were initiated long before that. And this priest, Petosiris, priest of the god Thoth, builds a unique tomb with reliefs in Greek style at the entrance and in the hall, inside the tomb. The reliefs are absolutely, rigorously Egyptian. The decoration is executed in a traditional manner, and he himself is buried there, along with his wife and 2 sons. Everything corresponds to Egyptian standards in the halls, coffins. Everything is as it's supposed to be. So he created for himself 2 kinds of worlds, right? A Greek world where he will stay after death, and a purely Egyptian world because Egyptians regard a tomb as the space they will exist in after death. This necropolis is situated in Middle Egypt, which practically makes it part of Upper Egypt. From ancient times, the country was divided into 2 parts, Upper and Lower Egypt. Each part had its own burial tradition. For instance, this is how bodies were buried in the north, in the Alexandria region. These are catacombs. They also represent a fusion of classical and Egyptian styles. But wherever bodies were buried, according to the Egyptian tradition, death did not prevent from further communication with the deceased. According to classical authors, the deceased were present at Egyptian feasts. It made some researchers come to the conclusion that mummies were first kept at home. In fact, we know about wooden cabinets with folding doors, where a mummy was kept vertically. Such objects are housed in the Berlin Museum. However, there was no space to store mummies in houses. Thus, it would be more correct to think that such mummies in cabinets were exhibited in special rooms or chapels next to tombs, or in the necropolis. After some time, the mummy was taken away and buried. It seems that relatives of the deceased gathered every year in premises next to the tombs and organized these feasts of the dead, feasts of commemoration. The cult of offerings to the dead and gods existed in Egypt as well as in the classical culture. But apparently it was executed in the tombs or chapels close to them. Every Egyptian tomb contained glass, metallic or ceramic objects, and food as well. Here is a unique Fayum portrait. It is unique because it is the only known portrait with such decorations. This is a boy inside a so-called edicula, a small temple. Below we see various food offerings. It can mean that the portrait was used for domestic cults, which indicates once more an amalgamation of the 2 traditions, the Roman and the Egyptian. This example of such an important Egyptian ritual, the burial, tells us about the large number of aspects that Greeks and Romans who had come to Egypt adopted and implemented in their cultures. But it also shows us that the Egyptians borrowed a lot of new elements too. And these amazing portraits, they could not appear and replace burial masks without Romans and their classical tradition. And we would never see the people the way they were 2,000 years ago.